Hello. This week brings us to the 28th week of the year, and the scripture readings that we will be looking at first comes again from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 25, verses 6 through 10a. Letter of Paul to the Philippians, chapter 4, verses 12 through 14, and then verses 19 through 20. And finally, the Gospel according to Matthew brings us back to chapter 22 to verses 1 through 14. Well, I say back to because it begins, as we can see. But what we find this time is the third of three parables that Jesus is pictured as addressing to the chief priests and the leaders, the elders, again remembering that they are pictured as coming from Jerusalem. All three of these parables, in a certain way, are pointedly directed kind of as a critique of the leadership of Judaism. I mention again, as we have frequently noted, that this is not on the part of these parables or Jesus' teaching an attack against Judaism or Israel in general, but rather particularly to the leadership that was taking place at the time that Matthew's gospel was written. Now, this third parable has a parallel parable also in Luke's Gospel, in chapter 14. We have looked at part of that last year when we considered this. And also this parable is found in the Gospel of Thomas. Now we have alluded to this Gospel. It was a Gospel discovered a century ago, and has a great deal of discussion. Some believe that wonder why it was never included in the canonical section. Some believe that it was written late in the first century. Others believe that it might have been written even earlier than the synoptic gospel Mark was first written. Now that's another whole story, but it is kind of interesting that this particular parable is found there. Now the way in which, and this is what we're going to look at, the way in which Matthew looks at this parable. What is this parable? Well, the parable is the story, as you will note, of a king who decides to create a banquet in honor of his son's wedding. So it is really pictured by Matthew as a wedding feast. He sends out invitations to people to come. They at first refuse. He sends out a second invitation. They refuse again. Since they refuse, he now sends his servants to go out to the highways and the byways and to bring in all that he can find, and they come in and they fill the banquet hall. And finally, as we will hear, it concludes with the owner, or that is the king, and in this case, that's who is the originator of this particular event, comes into the kind of wedding feast, finds someone who is not dressed appropriately, and excoriates him for that. All right, that's quickly the parable itself. Let's now look at it, analyze it a little bit, how this works. And perhaps to notice a couple of differences between the way in which Luke handles this and Matthew presents it. As Matthew presents it, it is a king who originates this banquet for his son. So it's a wedding banquet. Unlike in Luke, where he doesn't really tell you what the banquet is for, only that a man, we assume, a rather well-to-do man, organizes a banquet. So you can see some changes, and we will, as we go along, see that What Matthew manages to do a bit is to what we would call make allegorical interpretations or implications to this also. So it is this process of allegorizing that Matthew, we've seen last time and in other occasions, takes material, and therefore by allegorizing it gives it a distinctively Christian interpretation, which is fine, just as long as we kind of notice what Matthew has done. Now, when the king sends out invitations, and here's the procedure, it is perhaps important to notice the background a little bit on how this would have been understood and how it works. When he sends out invitations, who's he going to invite? Well, he is... it's most likely that commoners are not going to be invited to this banquet. In other words, it's going to be people who belong to the social class of the king and, of course, of his son, and they are the ones who would be invited. So essentially, it's royalty who are invited to this banquet, or if it's not only royalty, but it's what we would call today VIP, very important persons in the court of the king. Now, therefore, the invited guests would be, as I mentioned, landowners, business persons who in some way are very much a part of the entourage that regularly associate in the king's court. What they do, now this is a common practice, by the way, in antiquity, is that when the first invitation is given, those who are invited do a couple of things. Well, the first they do, and I give this not particular order, but you can see how it might work, that they check out who else is invited to this banquet and also who is not invited to it. So that's the first kind of thing that they do. See who else would be there and who else will not be there. Secondly, they consider what kind of preparations the king has made or has not been made. So again, they kind of look at the whole structure of what this occasion will be like. And then next, they kind of check out who of those who have been invited are planning to attend and who of those who have been invited are not going to be coming or plan to stay away. So you can see if key people decided to stay away, so maybe they would also stay away and refuse the invitation to come. Now, keeping in mind here too that those who refuse to come are also shaming the king who invites them to this banquet. So their excuses for coming, some of them are flimsy, others are rather insulting excuses. What essentially they are saying when they refuse to come is, well, the businesses that we have are more important than honoring your son and you in the banquet that you are providing. So that's all kind of background to this, and that's why a second invitation is given. This would have been somewhat expected, that the first time a refusal or a kind of non-acceptance takes place, so that the second invitation comes, assuming, of course, that those who had been invited had been done the kind of things that we just mentioned. They've gone through this little process. Now, what happens here, as we hear this parable, is that the guests challenge him. Therefore, the king's honor is at stake here. And they do it in a direct fashion by seizing his slaves, beating them, and killing them. Now, here's where we move into what is probably, some point out, a bit of an exaggeration on the part of Matthew. But again, keep in mind why he is narrating this parable and to whom it is addressed it. So, by this action on the part of those who receive the invitation a second time, the king is really placed into a position where he has to respond. After all, he has been shamed. Some of his own entourage has been affected, murdered. So he can't just let it go. Pass it off as if, well, it didn't matter. So what do you think he does? Well, he sends in his troops, kills those murderers, burns their city, and in this way salvages his honor and covers his shame. Now again, whether there would be enough time for all of this is interesting and seems to be, to some degree, as I mentioned, an addition made by Matthew. Although, I suppose, one notices that this reaction on the part of the king, although it is parabolic and allegorized here back in Jesus' time, interestingly reflects certain events when we think about history today, events occurring in our own time that may well kind of follow a pattern here that was traditional even in the first century world. I don't know, can't make judgments here, but there is, sometimes is there not, an interesting parallel between what was and what is. Now, the king, at this point, he has followed the rules, breaks the rules by inviting to the banquet those who are what we would call non-elites, those who would not have ordinarily been brought in or invited, and they would be perhaps people who very rarely, if ever, went to the palace and came into the presence of the king. Now keep in mind here that the elite in Jesus' time, and certainly in the time in which this parable lives, were making up only about 5 to 10% of the population. And they lived, here's an interesting thought, they lived in the center of the city. Now today, very often when we think of or later on even sometimes in Roman society, thought of the elite as living in the area around the city, or what we today might call the suburbs. But in this situation of cities in the first century time, and this dates back a number of centuries into earlier times, lived right in what we would call downtown area. And what was found there? What was found there was the basic business center, the best social center, religious center, and if you look at really the way in which many of our cities were originally founded, even in our own country, notice why downtown was the most important place to be. Only the poorer or the non-elites surrounded the city and therefore lived in the what we would call the outskirts. So in our society, of course today, we have reversed that, see? But keep in mind here, where these very well-to-do, well-positioned folks lived, and why the major events within any particular town, village, or city took place. All right. Now, the servants are sent out to the highways and the byways. Now, let me give you, I have a little quote here from a historian who describes what the highways and byways were like in the first century world. And here's what the man is Rauenbach describes the highways of the time. These are his, this is his thought. Most streets were unpaved, narrow, and badly crowded, and would not have allowed passage of wheeled vehicles. Many would have been choked with refuse, and frequently with scavenging dogs, pigs, birds, and other animals. Shallow depressions in the street allowed some drainage, but also acted as open sewers. Large enough open spaces were few in most cities, and those that did exist were often intersections of a few paved thoroughfares. Such open squares often served as gathering places for ceremonies and public announcements. So that's the way in which he describes what these streets were like, lest you kind of picture them somewhat as we do, although some of you will say you should see my street and it would fit that pattern. Well, I don't know. That's just as an aside. So the people who lived on the outskirts, and who were they? Well, they were people who had something to contribute to those who lived in the inner city or in the city itself. Tanners, beggars, prostitutes, these were all kinds of people who lived on the outskirts. But people whose services were needed in the city and not permitted to live in it. So Matthew often describes the undesirable as certainly not being there. The poor and the crippled, where did they have to live? In the outskirts area. So I give all of this a kind of social background to the story that we hear, and hopefully it kind of gives us a little insight into the whole custom here, okay? So the main roads, therefore, were also, however, the thoroughfares into the city. And before you got to the city or there, got into it, so there are these little, even geographic divisions, if you kind of have a picture of this, were squares or plazas in which the different streets came interjected. And so they were open areas where you could see things and could be seen. So bringing non-elites to his table to eat with him could prompt his fellow elites to cut ties with him. So see that what the king is doing is a risky business by inviting what we would be considered by the elites as the wrong people. And if he is inviting them to the guests, then maybe we don't want to be related with him anymore, although certainly as being king, they would be careful about this. However, if it were, and we went to Luke's account, where it's just a man who kind of has this feast, well, they might be more ready to break relationships with him because they don't have as much a vested interest, although they do, in who he is and what he is allowed to happen. So, again, comparing as we have here Matthew's account with Luke's, Luke does not tell us what the banquet is all about. By the way, when the people refuse, give excuses, and they give real reasons. In Matthew's account, they really don't tell why they're not coming, only that they're not coming. So those are, and if you have the opportunity, you can go back and kind of notice the contrast between Matthew and Luke's description of this particular parable. As I say, Matthew has those who refuse give no reasons why they're doing what they refusing what they are doing. So there are also some connections. These three parables, keep in mind that they are all addressed to the same persons, and that there is a certain interrelationship that each of them have. Violence, for example, seems to have taken place. Remember, in the vineyard story, occurs again here. Those are some of the characteristics that still remain. Now, finally, is the guest who decides not to wear a wedding garment when he appears. Now, what's the problem here? Why didn't he have a wedding garment? Did he have time to get one? After all, if he is one of the non-elite, he perhaps did not have readily available a wedding garment. Now, years ago, someone tried to kind of justify this by his refusal to have a wedding garment by saying that the owner, the king in this case, would have provided a garment for him. He simply refused to wear it. Much like in earlier times, and maybe that's still the case, in some restaurants, men are expected to wear suit coats, and if they come and don't have them, well, the really highfalutin of restaurants would have some suit coats available and would give one to the man. Now, that was one way in which this was interpreted. We're not sure that really ever happened in the time of Matthew or Jesus. So the fact that he has is undressed for the wedding feast, when the king comes in, what's the problem? Well, he is shaming, dishonoring the king by not having an appropriate garment on. So some would say, well, maybe one of the messages of this particular little episode is that one must be ever ready for the arrival or the opportunity. Well, that's all well and good too, isn't it? But again, all of that is a little bit of background why the king is pictured in a way of having no choice but to throw out this guest who doesn't have a wedding garment because he is dishonoring the king and bringing shame to him and consequently to his family, and one could also say to his son. So that's a little bit the background for the wedding garment episode. Like we say, and someone has said that this guest chose to not be dressed for the feast. Well, all right, yeah, but you can see some of the explanations as to why that is the case. Now, this has been highly allegorized, certainly by Matthew, and he presents really a number of unrealistic details as you go back now and look at this parable as Matthew tells it. The ability to bring all these troops in to do all of this mass murder and execution quickly, and to reorganize invitations and to find all those people to come in within the quick span of the banquet setting are a little bit imaginative. Perhaps, again, because Matthew is very sensitive to the Hebrew Scripture or to the Old Testament, it is important to notice that in some ways the organizer of banquets, and this is where I'd like to go a little bit, is found in what was known as the wisdom tradition. Lady Wisdom is pictured. And remember, the wisdom tradition is material organized in the Old Testament between the time of Jesus, the first century, and maybe 200 or so years before. So the wisdom writing was very popular, and Lady Wisdom is often pictured as inviting all to her banquet. So with that in mind, we turn, let's quickly to, again, Isaiah. This little section of Isaiah is known as the Little Apocalypse, or the Apocalypse of Isaiah, and therefore would have been written later in the tradition of Israel. Later brings it closer to our time. In it, people seem to have lost hope. Now, this is when we look at this little section chosen by Isaiah, and have lost all hope and confidence in human efforts. And it represents a really political or historical realm. Now, what we are pictured with here is what we would call, we like this word, do we not, eschatological banquet, which equals eternal happiness. And as Isaiah presents it, God personally centers this banquet, and it features the best of all that is available to eat and to drink. So God is pictured as destroying death, as a negative force that diminishes life at every level and in every way. God will reprove the reproach, that is the shame of his people who have lost honor, which is tantamount to death. So keep in mind that all of this has to do with the people who have been led into exile, and Isaiah is writing words of encouragement that what God will do is restore honor. And when honor is restored, it brings joy, fulfillment, and peace, and every imaginable good thing. And as Isaiah presents it, God has done what no one else can do. And so it's important to notice that human efforts in making things perfect, peaceful, may fail, but God's ways will not, and God will ultimately will do this. So even Isaiah says that if you forget about the ability of God to do all these good things, it's like, we would say shooting oneself in one's foot by rejecting or forgetting that God always will do and does the honorable thing. And so this coronation feast, which is the way Isaiah presents it, will be provided for all people, for all the Gentiles, and all will be gathered together on Mount Sinai, or Mount Zion. So remember, that's the hill on which the city of Jerusalem rests. It is always important to notice that there is a universalism to the message of the prophets of Israel. They include other people, but it is that they will be reunited or be united with the Jewish community, with the faith of Israel, with the one God whom Israel proclaims on the mountain. So you can kind of see a grand picture of all of the world kind of being joined together in Jerusalem. There also was, we are told, a Canaanite god of death known as Mot, M-O-T. And when we look a little bit at the Hebrew words here, that may have been one of the kind of background issues also in this little scene as Isaiah presents it. And that moat will be destroyed, see, and the veil will be lifted. So it's a wonderful, what we would call eschatological understanding that ultimately there will be this great feast of the Lord. All will be called to it, and the center, from Matthew's point of view, although certainly we never forget the importance of Mount Zion, but the center for Matthew revolves around Jesus. And so once again, We have what we call a Christological interpretation, and it is a word, again, addressed to the leadership of Matthew's time. Please change your ways and accept the truth, who is Jesus. Thank you for being with us, and hope to see you again.